Today, we look at a case that took place in Toledo in 1980, and because of its unusual circumstances, shook the entire United States. It was the murder of a nun in the sacristy of a Catholic hospital at Easter time. Moreover, the murder bore the hallmarks of a possible ritual act, which raised many questions among the public that remained unanswered for more than 2 decades. The case was shelved for lack of evidence, but in 2003, new information emerged that reignited the investigation. A year later, a perpetrator very unexpected to the people was arrested. So let's take a look together at the case of the murder of Sister Margaret Ann and explore the circumstances of this now solved case. Today's story took place in the city of Toledo, located in northern Ohio at the western tip of Lake Erie. In the 1980s, this city had a truly unique atmosphere. Toledo was an industrial center with densely populated neighborhoods and a large variety of plants, steel mills, and glass factories. But what made Toledo really special was its Polish community. The streets smelled of traditional Polish food from every corner. Polish festivals were held there, and Polish newspapers were published. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, large groups of Poles came to the city looking for work in the factories. And of course, they brought their faith with them. Catholicism was ubiquitous in Toledo. Churches and various Catholic institutions stood on every corner and were key pillars of the local community. There were many Catholic schools and hospitals in town, and one of them was Mercy Hospital, where our story takes place. This hospital was run by the Roman Catholic religious order of the Sisters of Charity, whose mission is to help the sick and needy. It was a 7-story building on the edge of the city center, the top floor of which was home to 17 nuns. All of the nuns were experienced nurses who dedicated their lives to caring for the sick, injured, and dying. On the ground floor of the hospital was a small chapel where the nuns spent time in prayer, and the hospital also housed 2 priests who served as chaplains and spiritual support for the patients and staff. One of the nuns who lived here was Sister Margaret Ann. She was a 71-year-old lady who served as sacristan at the hospital and lovingly took care of the preparations for the masses in the hospital chapel. She was always very meticulous in her work, and people said she was a perfectionist. She set high standards for herself, which she demanded of others, and was never afraid to speak her mind. In the past, Sister Margaret had been the administrator of several hospitals, but as she aged, her strength waned and she lost her hearing. So she took on the less demanding but still important job of sacristan. It was another role in which she could serve the God to whom she had dedicated her life. Every morning she got up with joy to clean and decorate the chapel before the daily services. But April 5th, 1980 was a special day. It was White Saturday, one of the holiest days in the Christian calendar. White Saturday falls between Good Friday, when Christians around the world reflect on the death of Jesus, and Easter Sunday, when they celebrate his resurrection. Unlike most days, therefore, there was no morning mass, only a late afternoon service. Even so, Sister Margaret Ann was up at 5:30 in the morning. She changed into her traditional long dark blue dress with a white shirt and black veil and made her way to the chapel. For this special day, she planned to remove all the religious decorations from the altar. She had brought a tray with cleaning supplies, candles, and everything she needed. With the sun rising, she then headed to the cafeteria, where only she and one cafeteria worker were present. This was because most of the nuns were getting up later that day, and much of the staff had gone to stay with relatives for the Easter weekend. Sister Margaret quietly had her usual breakfast of grapefruit, cornflakes, and coffee, and got up from her desk at about 6:45. With a smile, she told the servers that it was time to clean up the chapel, and then left. Around 8 o'clock in the morning, another nun, Sister Madeline, went to the chapel. As she approached, she noticed a white linen cloth lying on the ground right in front of the chapel door. She thought it was a pillowcase that had been dropped by the cleaning service, so she picked it up and took it with her. Inside the chapel, Sister Philip was already sitting in the first pew, praying silently. Sister Madeline put the pillowcase away and also performed her set of prayers. Then she looked around and noticed that the chapel was not quite ready, which was strange because Sister Ann never left work unfinished. Madeleine walked over to the organ and checked the music for the White Saturday service. She noticed that the final song was missing. Father Robinson was responsible for choosing the music, so she decided to call him and bring it to his attention. At 8:45, she walked over to the door of the sacristy, where the nearest telephone was located. She took the handle, but for some reason the door was locked. So she reached into her pocket for her bunch of keys and unlocked the door. Inside the room, the blinds were closed and it was dark, so she couldn't see very well, but she noticed something on the floor. It looked like someone had left one of the practice dummies the nuns used for first aid training in the sacristy. Sister Madeleine bent down to get a better look at the dummy and suddenly jumped in terror. She turned and ran into the chapel screaming hysterically. Sister Philip, an elderly nun who was praying in the front pew, jumped up in surprise and asked what was wrong. Madeleine waved her arms until finally she shouted, "Sister Margaret Ann has been killed." Sister Philip ran into the sacristy and gasped. Margaret lay motionless on the floor with her arms and legs stretched straight out along her body. There appeared to be stab wounds on her face, and a small pool of blood had formed around her upper body. Her dress was rolled up and her underwear was pulled down to her ankles. Sister Madeleine's cries echoed throughout the west wing of the first floor, and soon a small group of nuns and a priest came running to the scene. They all ran to the sacristy to see and were horrified by the scene. It was clear that there was no help for Sister Margaret, and that she had died a violent death. The nuns had seen many people die, but this was different. The way she lay with her arms and legs straight out seemed terribly unnatural to them. And her dress wasn't just rolled up. The clothes was very carefully and neatly folded around her chest. It occurred to those present that the arrangement of the dead body looked almost ritualistic. Shortly thereafter, Mr. Swift's code was announced at the hospital. It was an internal hospital code that meant a person was in urgent need of medical attention. When the call of Mr. Swift came in, all medical staff knew they had to drop everything and rush to the victim's aid. So at this point, several more doctors and nurses made their way to the scene. At the same time, 2 police officers were having breakfast in the hospital's downstairs cafeteria when someone ran into the cafeteria screaming that there was a dead nun in the sacristy. The 2 quickly got up, ran up the stairs, and entered the chapel. When they got there were already a lot of people walking back and forth, so the crime scene was already heavily contaminated. A priest stood over the dead nun and prayed for her. At this point, someone had already pulled the nun's dress down so that she would not be exposed. The police officers immediately noticed the blood and stab wounds and realized they had to close the room immediately. Approximately 10 minutes later, 5 homicide detectives, led by Detective Chief Arthur Marks, arrived on the scene. They briefly examined the body and the crime scene and noticed that in addition to a large number of stab wounds to the upper body, the nun had strangulation marks on her neck. This immediately caught the detectives' attention because at the time, there was a serial killer in the Lake Erie area who strangled, stabbed, and left some of his victims lying with their blouses rolled up. It seemed that this killer's modus operandi was eerily similar to the way Sister Margaret Ann was murdered. This killer was nicknamed the Sunday Morning Slasher or Sunday Morning Killer because most of his attacks took place in the early hours of Sunday morning, but this was not always the case. The police had been searching for this perpetrator for a long time and had witness descriptions. He was believed to be a young man with dark skin. Police believed this killer could have killed up to 40 victims, all of whom were women. They were just wondering if this prolific killer could have struck in Toledo, and that's when the police radio started blaring. At the Greyhound bus station, just over a mile from the hospital, a suspicious-looking young man with dark skin, who matched the description of the Sunday Morning Slasher, was reported. 2 police officers, which were the first on the crime scene, were immediately dispatched to the station. They spent about an hour there, but no one knew anything about any suspicious person, and no one present admitted to calling the police. Meanwhile, 3 homicide detectives began interviewing nuns, doctors, and hospital staff, and 2 other detectives began searching the crime scene for clues. They began to take pictures on black and white film of every detail of the room and the individual injuries on Sister Margaret Ann's body. They estimated the attack began with a chokehold. There were large bruises on the sides of her neck, and Sister Margaret had red marks on her face. Another sign of strangulation were broken blood vessels in her eyes. It looked like strangulation alone would probably be enough to kill this old lady. But even so, her attacker decided to put her on the ground and start stabbing her. There wasn't a large amount of blood at the scene, which detectives explained by the fact that Sister Margaret was probably almost dead by the time the stabbing occurred. Her heart was barely pumping. They also noticed that she had traces of blood on her forehead and on the tip of her nose. It looked like someone had drawn a cross on her forehead with her own blood. Finally, the killer exposed her, leaving her in a humiliating position. When the detectives had everything photographed, they lifted several fingerprints from the sacristy door and sent them to the lab, even though there were plenty of people who might have left them there. In his experience, Detective Marks believed that, given the extent of the injuries, the perpetrator was probably someone who knew Sister Margaret. Either that, or the killer was someone with severe mental problems. But the odd thing was that the sacristy was locked. Sister Margaret's purse and her keys were found inside the sacristy. It looked like the killer must have had his own keys and could have been someone directly from the hospital. A team of 5 Toledo police detectives conducted more than 600 interviews over the next 3 weeks, mostly leading nowhere, but they did manage to gather a few clues. Sister Madeline, who was the first to find the body, said one thing stood out in her mind from that morning. She said she saw a dark-skinned man of about 20 years of age in the hospital that morning, who was neatly dressed and whom she did not know. He was walking down the corridor towards the chapel at about 7:30 in the morning. She added that people come and go in and out of the hospital all the time, and she is not sure if that is even worth mentioning. But it was significant to police because this man fit the description of a wanted serial killer. Sister Madeline also told police she found an altar cloth on the floor outside the chapel door this morning, which she originally thought was a pillowcase. She later took it with her, and when she unfolded it, she discovered it was an altar cloth that had several blood stains on it. She handed the linen to the detective who folded it, labeled it, placed it in a large brown paper bag, and placed it in the evidence room where it remained untouched for over 20 years. Police also spoke with the ambulance driver, who said he saw Sister Margaret Ann in the downstairs hallway below the chapel around 6:50 a.m., and that they exchanged greetings. It was shortly after she left the cafeteria, and it appeared that the driver was the last person to see the nun alive, except for her killer. Detectives also spoke to the hospital administrator, Sister Phyllis Ann. She was one of the few nuns who stayed calm the whole time. She told them that when she heard about the murder, she immediately started thinking about all the things she had to do. She began calling Sister Margaret's relatives, and then noticed that their head chaplain, Father Robinson, was nowhere to be found. So she called him too and told him what had happened. He replied that he would get dressed and hurry to the chapel. However, she never saw him at the scene. There were 2 priests working at the hospital, Father Swiatecki and Father Robinson. Father Swiatecki was a priest who arrived at the scene very early together with the nuns. He was an elderly, very tall and sturdy man who loved company. He often joked with people and even regularly stood outside the hospital, smoking cigarettes and telling jokes. He was also known to be a former alcoholic. His apartment was on the 2nd floor of the hospital. Father Robinson, on the other hand, was a shorter, thin man who was 41 years old. He was quiet, introverted, and a bit of a loner. His apartment was on the 1st floor, separated from the chapel only by a long corridor. Both priests were ordered to appear for questioning. Father Swiatecki told the police that when he learned of the murder, he was sitting in the cafeteria drinking coffee with the nuns, which was confirmed. Detectives noted, however, that it is not yet clear what he was doing before he came to the cafeteria, and theoretically, he could have had enough time to murder Sister Margaret beforehand. Moreover, they were intrigued that Father Swiatecki was at the scene of the crime before they arrived there, and he even touched Sister Margaret when he gave her the last rites. So they wondered if it was a deliberate attempt by him to cover his tracks. And then there was Father Robinson. He told the police that he spent the entire morning in his 2-bedroom apartment at the hospital. He said he was drying off after a shower when he got a call from Sister Phyllis, who told him that Sister Margaret Ann had been murdered in the sacristy. He stated that he did not leave his apartment at all until he received this call. He then put on his clerical collar and long black robe and ran to the chapel. Investigators took note of his statement and proceeded to interview other employees. The janitor and receptionist, who worked in the downstairs lobby, told police they heard some frantic footsteps around 7:30 a.m. on the day of the murder. It sounded like someone running down the hallway on the open balcony above them. The footsteps came from the direction of the covered passageway leading from the chapel and went down the hallway where Robinson was the only occupant. The janitor said the footsteps sounded like something was terribly wrong. They were curious as to what might have happened, so they tried to peer out onto the balcony, but they didn't have a good view. As they listened to the footsteps coming down the hallway, they waited for the sound of the metal fire door that was at the end of the hallway. This door opened with a push button and made a loud sound when opened, but they never heard the sound. The footsteps stopped just before the fire door, just inside the entrance to Father Robinson's apartment. In the meantime, an autopsy has been performed to determine the extent of Sister Margaret Ann's injuries. The autopsy report stated that she had suffered 31 stab wounds to the left side of her face, neck, and chest. The wounds were inflicted by an instrument with a blade at least 7.6 centimeters long and 1.3 centimeters wide, and the weapon had an unusual blade shape. It was not just a flat blade like most knives, but appeared to have 4 sides, and its cross-section was shaped a bit like a diamond. There was also evidence of strangulation that preceded it. 2 bones in her neck were broken because the strangulation was so severe. One of the nuns said that she could not find the large tailor's scissors that were in the sacristy, which Sister Margaret often used to trim the candles. So the police thought that these scissors might be the murder weapon. Sister then showed them other scissors that were identical in shape, but the missing ones were perhaps a little larger. The doctor who performed the autopsy stated that the scissors may have been the weapon used, but the wounds on the face were caused by a tool that was sharper than the scissors. The doctor also took various samples, clipped nails, and sent everything for testing to see if there were any foreign substances present, such as blood, that could be compared to the suspect. The doctor also concluded after thorough testing that Sister Margaret had not been raped. Detectives believed the killer was trying to set up the victim's body to look like a sexual assault, hoping that would lead investigators down the wrong path. 10 days after the murder, the police were still struggling with a lack of concrete evidence, but their attention was already focused on a few suspects. It was widely believed that the killer must be someone close to Sister Margaret Ann, someone who possessed both motive and opportunity for the crime. The detectives met every morning, and each day the list of possible suspects grew thinner, until finally they were left with only one name, Father Gerald Robinson. And that was a bit of a problem, because everyone knew how much power the church had in Toledo, even over the police. The police chief at the time, Ray Vetter, was good friends with Monsignor Jerome Schmidt, one of the most powerful clergy in the diocese. Several police officers testified that at the time it was unthinkable to arrest a priest. They said you would literally be fired if you did. There have been several cases of priests in the city who have been accused of harassment and abuse, but none have ever been arrested. Everything was just swept under the rug, and the priest was quietly transferred to another location outside of Toledo. However, now it was murder. The murder of a nun. So even though the detectives avoided it, they finally decided to check Father Robinson out. They started asking people about him, and eventually they learned something interesting. One of the hospital employees told police that the day before the murder, he witnessed Father Robinson and Sister Margaret arguing inside the chapel. Sister Margaret was not happy with the progress of the Good Friday service. She said she was upset because the priest cut the service short and it did not go as it should have. Sister Margaret reportedly even raised her voice at the priest, so it was clear that the two of them had some sort of dispute between them. Police were also contacted by lab technician Grace Jones, who said she saw Father Robinson coming out of the chapel on the morning of the murder wearing a long robe, wearing a hat and carrying a sports bag. She said she was not sure what time it was, only that it must have been after 7 a.m., and Mr. Swift's alarm was sounded not too long after that. Detectives were clear that they needed to question Father Robinson, and this time, really thoroughly and at the police station. When they brought him in, they asked him about inconsistencies in his statements about what he had been doing on the morning of the murder. He seemed uncomfortable with the questions and didn't reveal much. He just kept saying he was home all morning. And then, after a few hours of questioning, came the shock. Father Robinson said that someone had come to him in the confession room after the murder and confessed to him that he had murdered Sister Margaret Ann. Naturally, they began to ask him who it was and what exactly he had said. But Father Robinson refused to divulge this because a priest is never allowed to say anything he has learned in confession. In fact, he had already broken the rules by even telling them that someone had confessed to him in the first place. The detectives kept pressing him to at least tell them something, and Father Robinson finally put his head down and told them he was making it up. There was never any such confession. He said he was just trying to protect himself. He was trying to give them something so that the interrogation could be over. Father Robinson seemed physically and emotionally exhausted, and they decided to take him home for the day. However, they told him they wanted to continue tomorrow and asked for a warrantless search of his home. He nodded and signed a consent form. The next day, detectives entered Father Robinson's two-bedroom apartment. He left them alone and said he would go see patients in the meantime. They first looked around the bathroom and discovered a vial of Valium that had been displayed by the pharmacy on the day of the murder. Then they discovered something on the table that they were very interested in. It was a silver sword-shaped letter opener, about 22 centimeters long with a slightly curved square blade. It had a knurled metal handle, a knuckle guard, and a circular emblem on the handle. The emblem was stamped with a picture of the Capitol building, and the inscription, Wax Museum, Washington, D.C. It appeared that it might have been some sort of souvenir. However, the blade had 4 sides, consistent with the autopsy results. Detectives were sure they had the murder weapon. The next day, the opener was brought to the forensics lab and tested for fingerprints and the presence of blood. But it appeared to be perfectly clean. There were no prints on it at all and no traces of blood. It appeared that Father Robinson had either not used it at all or had recently cleaned it thoroughly. Finally, they thought of one more thing. They managed to peel the emblem off the handle and tested the underside for blood. When they rubbed it with the test solution, a small green dot appeared for a few seconds, indicating the probable presence of blood. The report stated that the amount was not sufficient for further testing. However, it was very likely that there was blood on this opener that could not be washed off because it had flowed into an inaccessible area. Later that day, Father Robinson was again taken to the station and subjected to a polygraph test. Before the test began, he stated that he was not feeling well, was very tired, and had not gone to bed until 2 a.m. the previous night. He then answered all the questions very slowly and thought long and hard about his answers, even to really simple and direct questions. The test results stated that Father Gerald Robinson was trying to be deceptive on the relevant questions relating to the murder of Sister Margaret Ann. Therefore, according to the test results, he lied. However, the priest explained this result by saying he was upset about the whole situation and had taken Valium before the testing, which could have affected the results. Eventually, a second date was suggested for the test, when Father Robinson would be more relaxed. This test was conducted by an investigator selected by Robinson's attorney and was conducted at the Catholic Diocese's headquarters. The results indicated that he passed the test, but that his reactions were inconsistent due to emotional stress. For this reason, it was stated that the test itself was of little use for diagnostic purposes. Robinson was then brought back for further questioning, but unfortunately this was not completed. In fact, there was a knock on the door of the interview room during the course of the interview. Behind the door stood Police Chief Vetter, his friend Monsignor Schmidt, and Robinson's lawyer. They allegedly took Robinson away without explanation. Detective Marks stated that when he saw them leave, he knew the case was over. Police Chief Vetter later stated that he certainly did not protect any suspect, but merely agreed with Monsignor Schmidt to talk calmly with Robinson and try to find out if he had anything to do with the murder. Whether Robinson had really told him anything, however, is not clear. The police have told the public that they have very few clues in the murder of Sister Margaret Ann and have come across nothing of substance. They have found no useful fingerprints, no clues, not even the murder weapon. Months and then years began to pass, and finally the case was officially dropped. Both Detective Marks and Police Chief Vetter later stated that they were convinced that Father Robinson was the perpetrator. Unfortunately, they said they did not have enough evidence to arrest him. Father Robinson left the hospital about a year after the murder and became pastor of 3 Polish churches in Toledo, where he served until 1989. His connection to the nun's murder was gradually forgotten, and most of the faithful were unable to even admit that a priest could do such a thing anyway. Life went on, and then there was an arrest on the other side of the country, in Texas. A man named Coral Watts was arrested, who was allegedly the Sunday morning slasher. Watts officially confessed to the murders of 13 women, but later hinted that his victims may have numbered more than 80. From 1974 to 1982, Watts traveled around the country, and at the time of his sister Margaret Ann's murder, he was in Michigan and Detroit, not too far from Toledo. When Toledo detectives saw his picture, they thought it looked exactly like the strange man Sister Madeline met at the hospital the day of the murder. Watts confessed to several murders, but claimed he had never killed anyone in Toledo, let alone a nun. In the end, nothing was found to prove any connection between Watts and the murder of Sister Margaret. Moreover, Watts consistently chose young women as his victims, and there were no elements of religious ritual in his actions. In 1993, after the death of his father, Robinson moved in with his mother in a small brick house right next to the police station. Neighbors said of him that he always wore a priest's suit and was never seen outside in a t-shirt. But he didn't talk much to anyone, and they said he didn't even greet the neighbors. He was sometimes seen working in his garden, playing records by Black Sabbath, which seemed a bit unusual for a priest. However, other people also said that the priest was popular with the elderly and was known for his thoughtfulness and kindness towards them. He was said to be very quiet, but whenever someone needed him, Father Robinson was there in seconds. Gerald Robinson seemed to be doing well and everything was fine. It wasn't until 23 years after the murder, in 2003, that the tide turned. Police were contacted by a nun who claimed to have memories of being abused as a girl by several priests. She said that really horrible things had happened to her as part of satanic rituals. She also claimed to have witnessed the ritual murder not only of animals, but also of a child. One of the priests she named in her testimony was Father Robinson. When this information came to the investigators of the Unsolved Homicide Unit, they immediately thought of him. They remembered that the word among the cops at the time was that he was the only suspect in the nun's murder case. But no one wanted to believe that a priest could do such a thing. Now that there was a connection between Father Robinson and Satanism, the detectives decided to reopen the case of Sister Margaret Ann's murder. As a first step, they decided to go through old evidence from the 1980s, among which they found something that had been overlooked for 23 years. It was an altar cloth that Sister Madeline found outside the chapel door on the day of the murder. The cloth was stained with blood in various places and had 18 holes in it. But detectives soon discovered that the holes fit together when the cloth was folded, and in fact, there were only 9 holes made by stabbing through the folded cloth. The other important thing was that the holes in the linen matched the placement of the wounds on Sister Margaret's body. It looked like someone had placed the cloth on her and then stabbed her through it. Then they noticed that the stab wounds were symmetrically arranged in the shape of a cross. An inverted cross, to be exact. It was so precise that it looked as if someone had placed an actual cross on the canvas and used it as a grid around which to stab. Investigators ran several tests and found that the holes in the canvas were compatible with the blade of Robinson's knife opener, which had a truly unique shape. It looked like they finally found a clear connection to Robinson. But that wasn't all. There were also bloodstains on the canvas that they said exactly matched the shape of the letter opener. It was as if the instrument was covered in blood and someone had placed it on the canvas, but they needed to verify their suspicions with experts. In 2003, there were only 5 people in the world certified in blood trace pattern transfer analysis. And detectives were able to contact 2 of them, Dr. Sutton and Dr. Lee. Both conducted numerous tests and concluded that the bloodstains on the altar cloth clearly matched the shape and design of Robinson's letter opener. They were even able to confirm that it was a letter opener with that particular emblem with the picture of the U.S. Capitol, because it too was imprinted on the canvas. In fact, the experts had no doubt that it was Robinson's letter opener that left the stains on the canvas. The detectives then contacted an expert in the occultism, a priest from Chicago named Jeffrey Grob. He confirmed to them that there were several irrefutable signs in this case that it was a satanic ritual. The most obvious sign, of course, were the stab wounds in the shape of an inverted cross. But Father Grob also noticed that all the wounds were on the left side of the body. He said that in occult crimes, perpetrators often stab only the left side of the victim's body, because Satanism is also known as the way of the left hand. The fact that she was a nun is also very significant, because a pure person who has dedicated her entire life to God is the highest possible sacrifice for Satanists. Among other signs of ritual murder, he cited choosing a date on a Christian holiday, stabbing through an altar cloth, and anointing the victim's forehead with his own blood. All of these things, he said, show an effort to desecrate Christian symbols and rituals. Father Grob said it was obvious that this was a ritual murder, and that the killer was someone with extensive knowledge of Catholic and Christian rituals. The next thing investigators wanted to look at was DNA traces. In 1980, DNA was not yet used as a tool for identifying suspects, so detectives hoped they could find at least some random samples among the evidence. In the end, they found the presence of male DNA only on the nun's underwear and on one of her fingernails, but both samples were too small to be fully tested. Nevertheless, they could still rule out a significant portion of the male population as donors. So they had to compare this small sample to Gerald Robinson's DNA. The detectives planned to continue analyzing and gathering evidence for some time, but their plans soon changed. It seemed that somehow the information about the investigation of Father Robinson had gotten out, and several reporters were already standing outside his house. There was a chance that Robinson still had some important evidence in his possession, and now he might want to get rid of it. So the police decided to act quickly. They got a search warrant that day and also wanted to arrest Robinson. When they knocked on his door, Robinson let the officers in and they began to question him, very gently and politely at first. But Robinson's answers were very slow and brought no new information. Then the detective spread crime scene photos on the table and asked him who could have done something like this. "Father, do you know who did this?" Robinson was silent for an inordinate amount of time, as if considering the answer, and then replied that he did not. This, too, led to nothing. Eventually, he was told that he was under arrest over the murder of Sister Margaret Ann, to which Robinson responded calmly and said not a word. Then they took him to the police station and tried to question him again. This time, Robinson revealed a little more. He said that when Sister Phyllis called him and told him about the murder, he was drying off after a shower. Then he dressed quickly and ran to the chapel. He entered the sacristy, and Father Swiatek was already standing there with several nuns. Swiatek reportedly looked at him and said, "You did it! Why did you do that?" Immediately, he just started accusing him. Robinson was supposedly shocked, so he didn't say anything. This story about the confrontation between him and Swiatek was particularly confusing to detectives because, according to the testimony of others, Robinson did not appear at the scene that morning. When he was asked about the letter opener, Robinson said he had never used it at all and had kept it in his desk as a souvenir. He said he got it as a gift from a Boy Scout troop sometime in the 60s. Robinson admitted that he did not lend the knife to anyone, but added that a cleaning lady had the keys to his apartment. When the detective left for a moment, Robinson was left alone in the room, but the camera continued to roll. He put his elbows on the table and hid his face in his hands. He sighed and then said, "Oh, my Jesus." And then he whispered something else quietly. When the detective returned, Robinson told him he realized he should have confronted Swiatek when the priest accused him of murdering Sister Margaret Ann. He said he didn't react normally, as a person accused of murder should, but he said he just doesn't have it in him to yell at someone. Robinson was then taken to the detention center, and there he traded his priest suit for a light brown prison jumpsuit. In the meantime, his residence was being searched. No major evidence was found, but there were some pretty strange things. First, there was a big box full of photos. Hundreds of photos, all of them of dead people in coffins. Some of the photos were black and white and looked like they were taken in the early 20th century. Others were new and had been printed on a computer. That was very strange. Anyway, they kept looking. They noticed that the priest didn't have many possessions. He had a radio, a television, several shelves full of books, and a small collection of tapes. Most of it was classical or Polish music. But he also had a few pieces of Black Sabbath and AC/DC. Then, deep in a drawer, they found a book published in the 70s called Occultism. It was obvious that someone had read it many times. It was very worn, and some passages were underlined. Underlined, for example, was the part of the chapter on the Black Mass where it talked about human sacrifices and that the chosen victim must be innocent. That was all they found in his house. Detectives then contacted a Polish priest and asked him if it was customary for them to take pictures of dead people in coffins. He told them that yes, it was a Polish tradition and a way to remember and honor loved ones who had died. He said it was an old custom, but one that was disappearing. They then asked him if it was common to have hundreds of such photos, and he said no. He said most people only keep such photos from their family and closest friends. On May 3rd, Gerald Robinson was indicted by a grand jury for the murder of Margaret Ann and released on bail the same day. His friends and supporters banded together to bail him out and mortgaged their homes, bringing the total bail to $400,000. Robinson was thus charged, but police had to continue gathering evidence. Because they arrested Robinson sooner than they originally wanted, they still had a few things to check. The first was Robinson's DNA. They tested it and found that it couldn't have been him who left DNA on the nun's underwear and her fingernail. According to them, it did not change the case because it was a small sample that could have gotten there anyway. It could even have been transferred by someone who was working with the evidence, because the lab technicians and police officers at the time did not even know the measures to protect the DNA from contamination. In any case, the fact that Robinson was excluded as the owner of this DNA was later used by the defense in court. The investigators were trying to obtain as much strong evidence as possible, and therefore decided to exhume the nun's body so that they could compare the stab wounds with the letter opener. They focused mainly on wounds that hit a bone and examined what mark the weapon made on the bone. Perhaps the clearest mark was left in the left side of the lower jaw, also called the mandibular. This is one of the hardest bones in the human body, and it was in this bone that there was a small but very distinctive triangular impression. The doctor removed this part of the bone with an electric saw and then did a fit test. She used a solution to clean the soft tissue from the bone, and then with extreme care she inserted the tip of the letter opener inside. In her report, she stated that it fit perfectly in there like a key in a lock, and that the injury was caused by a weapon exactly like this one. To be sure, the detectives asked another expert for his opinion, who used a slightly different method. He made a cast of the bone and the opener blade and created replicas. He then ran tests and concluded that it was a good match. That was good news for the investigators, but they still had one more thing to do. They wanted to re-interview some of the witnesses who testified in 1980, at least those who were still alive and available. They found a doctor named Jack Barron, who told them that when he heard Mr. Swift's code on the day of the murder, he went quickly to the chapel. He went down the stairs, but then accidentally took a wrong turn and headed down the hall in the wrong direction. When he realized this, he turned and walked towards the chapel. At that moment, a priest whose description matched Robinson's walked past him in the opposite direction. He thought it was strange because everyone else was now hurrying towards the chapel. Anyway, the priest looked back at him over his left shoulder and pierced him with his eyes. Dr. Barron told the detectives that this was exactly what he had said back in the 80s, but the policeman didn't write anything down then and quickly moved on to the next question. Next, detectives found former lab technician Grace Jones, who they knew had also spotted Robinson at the chapel that morning. Grace reportedly told her boss at the time that she had just seen the priest in the hallway, but he gave her a stern look and told her not to say anything about it because the priest was a man of God. If she wanted to keep her job, she said, she had better keep quiet. So the police had 2 witnesses who saw Robinson on the morning of the murder, although he claimed to have been in the room the whole time. And soon a 3rd witness came forward. It was an EKG technician, Leslie Ann Kerr. She said she saw Father Robinson standing at the chapel around 7 a.m. He was wearing a clerical collar and a long black robe. She didn't think much of it at the time. When police asked her if she had seen anyone unusual in the hospital, she said no, because it wasn't unusual to see a priest at the front of the chapel. Moreover, Leslie knew nothing about Robinson being suspicious or claiming to have been home all morning. But now that she saw that Robinson had been arrested, she finally decided she had to report it after all these years. All of these people testified at the trial, which began on April 24, 2006. And there was a bit of a problem with jury selection early on. Several potential jurors basically told the judge that they could not and would not convict a priest of murder. In the end, 12 jurors were selected who had no problem with that, but prosecutors still feared that Robinson being a priest might play a role for some. Moreover, Robinson came to court dressed as a priest. He reportedly showed no emotion during the trial, and at times appeared to be falling asleep or meditating. All the time he was sitting alongside his 4 defense attorneys, who represented him for free because they believed he was innocent and needed help. The prosecution called a lot of witnesses to the stand. The detectives who handled the case in 1980 were there, and they testified about how Robinson sometimes contradicted himself in his statements, and also about how he told them that someone had confessed to the murder. Then, of course, the investigators who reopened the case in 2003 also testified. Then all the experts who worked on the case testified as well. The jury was particularly interested in the presentation of the photos of the bloodstains on the cloth. They seemed impressed when they were presented with how the picture of the US Capitol from the medallion perfectly matched the details in the bloodstain. Then, 3 witnesses who saw Robinson at the chapel that morning spoke. Next on the stand was a woman named Rose Byers, who worked as a night nurse at the hospital. She said that every day for 18 years she went to the chapel at about 7 o'clock in the morning to pray before going home. She did so every single day, but she did not do so on the day of the murder. In fact, when she arrived at the chapel shortly after 7 o'clock, it was locked, which had never happened before. Her testimony was crucial because witnesses saw Father Robinson at the chapel at 7 a.m., and moments later it was suddenly locked. Also testifying at the trial was the ambulance driver, who said he met Sister Margaret Ann in the hallway at 6:50 a.m. as she was heading back to the chapel. This was important, so that the jurors would know that Sister Margaret really did not die until the moment Father Robinson was hanging around the chapel, and not perhaps several hours earlier. In court, videos of all the defendants' interrogations are usually played, but since no one filmed the interrogations in 1980, only the video of the last interrogation shortly after the arrest was shown. When Robinson was alone in the room, he said, "Oh my Jesus," and then whispered something unintelligible. But defense attorneys hired an audio expert to amplify the sound and find out what Robinson was saying. The amplified recording was played in the courtroom, and it was clearly understood how Robinson said sister or sister. The rest of the words were still indistinct. But according to the defense attorney, Robinson said, "Sister, please come back and tell them I didn't do it." Defense witnesses included a doctor who examined DNA from the victim's fingernails, and she said the only DNA found in those tests came from a man and could not have come from Robinson. Then an anthropologist also testified, questioning the testing of the damaged mandibular bone. She stated that because the tip of a letter opener was inserted inside the defect, the bone could have been damaged, and the shape of that damage may have changed. On May 10th, all of the witness testimony was completed, and closing arguments occurred. The prosecution lawyer told the jury that this case had to wait 26 years before it could be fairly tried. He said if the jurors had been sitting there in 1980, they probably couldn't even find 12 people who believed the priest was capable of killing someone. He said that if any of them don't think Robinson is the killer, then they believe an amazing series of coincidences. Then a photo of Father Robinson from 1980 was shown on the screen, with brown hair and youthful vigor. He said he was not asking the jury to convict a 68-year-old man. He was asking them to convict a 41-year-old man who committed this crime 26 years ago, which they proved beyond a reasonable doubt in court. Defense counsel, on the other hand, said in closing argument that Father Robinson is innocent, and that the state of Ohio has not proven beyond a reasonable doubt that his letter opener was the murder weapon. He argued that cold case investigators were never interested in seeking justice. They were only interested in arresting Robinson. The jury deliberated for less than a day and then reached a verdict. They found Gerald Robinson guilty of the murder of Sister Margaret Ann. Robinson stood motionless during the verdict, blinking only a few times. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of release after 15 years. Even though Robinson was convicted, he publicly stated from prison several times that he was innocent. Most recently, in 2012, he said he wished whoever did it, if they were still alive, would come forward and confess. His lawyers tried to appeal several times and eventually requested a review hearing. They created a 60-page petition in which they tried to pin the blame on another priest, Father Swiatecki, who was dead by then. The petition included a statement signed by Sister Dorothy, who described Swiatecki as an immoral man with a very bad temper. It was also pointed out that he had struggled with alcoholism for years and owned a large collection of knives because he liked to carve. The petition included testimony from one of the former guards at the hospital, who claimed that he had undertaken an amateur investigation himself after the murder of Nurse Margaret and concluded that Swiatecki was the killer. He even allegedly confronted him with it, and the priest allegedly replied, "What if I did it? Who do you think you are? Look around you. You are nobody. No one will believe you." But these accusations were countered by investigators who, in 1980, through successive interviews of all the staff, concluded that Swiatecki could not have committed the murder because he was constantly in the presence of other people. Another theory that Robinson's lawyers pushed in their appeals was that the Sunday morning serial killer, Coral Watts, was behind the nun's murder and was also already dead. He died of cancer in 2007. None of the efforts by Robinson's lawyers were successful, and Robinson remained in prison until his death in 2014, when he died from the effects of a massive heart attack. He reportedly became accustomed to prison, and many of his fellow inmates came to him for confessions. Shortly before his death, he stated that he was in the place where the Lord God wanted him to be, in this prison for these people. Even after Gerald Robinson died, he continued to stir up controversy. The Catholic Diocese of Toledo has announced that his funeral will follow the usual protocol for the burial of a diocesan priest. Indeed, he was never laicized and was still an ordained priest at the time of his death. Many people were outraged that a convicted murderer would go to his grave with all the glory of a priest in good standing. So, what do you think about this case? Was Robinson really a murderer, or was it someone else? Let me know your opinion in the comments below the video. And that's all for today. If you liked the story, then I would be very happy if you give it a like and subscribe to this channel so you don't miss any more videos. Thank you all again for watching, liking and commenting and subscribing, and I will look forward to seeing you again next time.